Hi, welcome to our next segment. In this video, we're going to be talking about the art movement of realism, or continue talking about it, and transition into the art movement of Impressionism. So this is the first artist we're going to be looking at. It's Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, done in 1863. We started to discuss this painting during class. You hadn't seen it before, and I think you guys did a fantastic job analyzing the painting and really hit on some important features and conventions that we are going to be discussing in this video. So you guys did a really excellent job. So Luncheon on the Grass was a number of works that broke away from the classical view that art should obey established conventions and seek to achieve this sort of idea of timelessness. You know, think of the neoclassical movement and these sort of ideas of history paintings that we looked at earlier. The painting was rejected by the salon that displayed paintings approved by the official French Academy, and the rejection was not so much because of the female nude. Obviously, we've seen female nudes in high Renaissance paintings in earlier periods, you know, and it was considered a classical subject. But because he took the female nude and put her in the presence of, in a modern setting, in the presence of clothed bourgeois men. And so this really sort of shifted this idea that, you know, women were not goddesses, but models and real people, and possibly prostitutes. So, as I mentioned earlier, it was rejected by the jury of the 1863 Salon, and this is just to show you what a salon looked like during the 19th century. Paintings were really hung it's not what we think of it in terms of a gallery today, where things are sort of hung and spaced apart nicely, but things were really crammed on the wall and hung really way up and up into the ceiling. And obviously these were very social events that people attended. Manet chose to display his painting instead at the Salon des Refus, which was an alternative salon established by those who had been refused entry into the official one. So while Manet was, he really was paying tribute to this European artistic heritage. We can see that he definitely was borrowing his subject, in particular, the Pastoral Concert by Titian. We discussed this painting when we were looking at Venetian High Renaissance painting. And then also some of these other engravings below, one done by Morcantano Raimondi, and then also this other engraving, which was done by Raphael, and this is known as the Judgment of Paris. And you really do see that he's really making these sort of classical references, but he, obviously does it in a different way. What people were so offended was that the presence of a nude woman among clothed men is justified neither by mythological or allegorical precedents, as we see here in this painting and these engravings done by these high Renaissance artists. And I apologize, I'm sorry. Pastoral Symphony should be attributed to the artist Giorgione. There is some debate that I think it used to be attributed to him, and now it's being attributed back to Titian. Either way, it's a high Renaissance Venetian painting, and clearly Manet was influenced by it. And, other things, the contemporary dress, and this depiction in the landscape really created this sort of strange, almost unreal scene that for a 19th century audience would have really viewed this as obscene. Manet himself jokingly nicknamed his painting La Partie Carrée, which translates, a party of four, or we are a party of four. And obviously there's some sort of erotic implications implied there. Here's a detail, and you really can see how he really did borrow the compositional arrangement from the high Renaissance classical engraving that we looked at in the previous slide. So earlier when we were discussing our segment of photography and realism, we had talked about the painter Courbet. And like his friend Courbet, and they were friends, Manet influenced modern painting not only by his use of a realistic subject matter, but he also challenged the three-dimensional perspective ism that, had been established by Renaissance painting. Manet's painted figures had a flatness to them, and this was derived partly from exposure to Japanese art. And we will be looking at that as well, and this movement of Japanism, where people were really, these Japanese prints were coming into Europe, and people were just loved them, and were really, a lot of artists were very influenced by them. And so Manet's painting style is much more of a diagonal painter. He did outline. He isn't using color to sort of build up these sort of natural transitions of light and shade. And so some people weren't very impressed with this style. And his treatment, his painting style and treatment were considered shocking, and almost as shocking as the subject itself. Again, he made no transitions between the light and dark elements of the picture. He abandoned, subtle gradations between, light and dark and shading, and really tried to do these, these very exaggerated contrasts. And so, people had become so, in love with the high Renaissance painting and these sort of, this sort of idea of perspective and this, realistic, use of chiaroscuro and sfumato, those things established by Leonardo da Vinci. And so, again, it was very shocking for audiences. And also, in addition to sort of the flat contour approach of Manet's painting style, he also had this sort of uncomfortable, people were confused by this sort of sketchy background of the woods, and again, its lack of perspective and depth, and so people were a bit off-put by it. So we'll look at some details of the painting. The painting features a nude woman who seems to be casually lunching with two fully dressed men. Her body is starkly lit, and she stares directly at the viewer, almost in a very confrontational way. The two men, dressed as young dandies, seem to be engaged in conversation and almost seem to ignore the woman, even though I think they do, compared to pastoral concert, the Venetian High Renaissance painting, they clearly, this is a real woman, and she is in their presence, and they are aware of her in that respect. The man on the right wears a flat hat with a tassel, and this was a hat that was normally worn indoors, and so this hints that perhaps this was painted in Manet's studio, indoor studio. Manet also deliberately chose a very large canvas size, so this painting measures by 208 by 264 centimeters. And again, this large scale was usually reserved for historical, religious, and mythological subjects. And so the style of this painting breaks with that academic tradition of the time. And again, this is another reason why it was probably rejected from the official salon. He did not try to hide his brushstrokes, and the painting even looks unfinished in some parts of the scene. The nude is also starkly different from the smooth, flawless figures of such painters as Ingres that we looked at when we were discussing the transition from neoclassicism into romanticism. The image below is Ingres, the Grand Odalisque that we talked about in our segment of romanticism. And you can see definitely, this sort of enamel painting style. And remember, Ingres did not show his brush strokes at all, and was really much more of a linear painter as well. When we look at a detail of the background, we see a lightly sort of scantily clad woman who seems to be bathing in a stream. And she is a bit of a confusing figure because she really, in perspective, is too large in comparison with the figures in the foreground, and she kind of seems to float above them. And so, maybe she represents a muse, maybe, again, it's unclear what her symbolism might be. And the roughly painted background lacks depth and perspective, giving the viewer the impression that the scene is not taking place outdoors, but again signifying that perhaps this was, composed in Manet's studio indoors. In front of them, the woman's clothes and a basket of fruit and a rounded loaf of bread are displayed as a still life. And her clothes have, sort of been cast off as well. You can see her hat and her dress. I'm not sure if these are oranges, but I read somewhere too, an art historian says that Manet often sort of associated oranges with prostitutes as a symbol of prostitutes. And I'm not clear if those are oranges or peaches, but I thought I'd throw that out there. And here are some other details, just to give you a sense of, I hope I didn't confuse you in describing him as a diagonal painter, because I know in some ways when you think of Romanticism and colorito, the sort of building up of color, Manet, had a very rough painting style. I mean, he's still outlined here, like you can see here with the hat, there's black right there, but he, didn't use these sort of subtle transitions of building color and tone the way a lot of colorito painters, like the Venetian artist, and some of the romantic painters that we looked at. Again, here are some more details, just to give you a sense of his unique painting style. And there's some details that have been noted by other art historians that really show how deeply connected Manet was to this particular painting, Luncheon on the Grass. Some historians have pointed out that the landscape of the painting is meant to represent a property that belonged to Manet's family that was just up on the Seine River. And also Manet often used real models. And this is something you might want to parallel with the Baroque artist Caravaggio that we talked about earlier with Baroque art. And he knew these people, and he often referenced them during when he would discuss his creation process. And the female nude depicted here is thought to be Victorine Menret. I'm not saying her name right. Victorin, and her last name is Meurent. And she was a woman that became one of his frequent and favorite models that he portrayed. We'll see her presented again in a painting called Olympia, and she was believed perhaps to be a prostitute. The male figure on the right was based on a combination of his two brothers, Eugene and Gustave Manet, and the other man is supposedly based on his brother-in-law, the Dutch sculptor named Ferdinand Leenhoff. And so, in some ways, some art historians refer to this scene as perhaps Manet's family portrait. Some other interpretations about what critics during the 19th century found shocking about this painting was really the interaction, or perhaps lack of interaction, between the three main subjects in the foreground and the woman bathing in the background. There are many contrasting qualities to the painting that juxtapose and distance the female nude from the other two male subjects. One historian pointed out that the feminine versus the masculine, the naked versus the clothed, and the white color palette versus the dark color palette creates these social differences that distinguish this, this hierarchy between men and women. In addition, viewers were intrigued by the questions raised by the gaze of the nude woman. Some we're wondering if she's challenging the viewer or accepting the viewer, looking past the viewer, engaging the viewer, or even looking at the viewer at all. And a lot of you did comment on her gaze and seemed, again, there was lots of questions and sort of this, this interesting ambiguousness about it, that you could project a lot of different interpretations and ideas about women. And so this encounter of her gaze identifies the gaze as a figure of the painting itself, as well as the figure object of the woman's gaze. And so it, the gaze also becomes sort of the main focal point and subject of the painting. So there's a lot of interesting sort of psychological references, I think, or implications being infused into the painting. This is another painting done by Manet called Olympia. It was first exhibited at the 1865 Paris Salon, which shows a nude woman, Olympia, lying on a bed, being brought flowers by a black servant. Olympia was again modeled on Victorine Minuret, Manet's favorite model, and like Luncheon on the Grass, Olympia seems to have this very confrontational gaze that caused a lot of shock and astonishment when the painting was first exhibited. There are also a number of details in the picture that identify her directly as a prostitute that people were extremely offended by. So what shocked audiences, again, was not necessarily her nudity, nor the presence of her fully clothed maid, but this confrontational gaze, and some other details that indicate her status as a prostitute. Things that indicate this are the orchid in her hair, her bracelet, her pearl earrings, and the oriental shawl. And these all are symbols of wealth and sensuality, and probably gifts that she has received from suitors. The black ribbon around her neck, in stark contrast with her pale flesh and her cast-off slippers, sort of also really give this idea of this very voluptuous interior and atmosphere. And Olympia was a name or a term associated with prostitutes in the 1860s in Paris at the time. As we talked about in class, the painting is modeled after Titian's Venus of Urbino, done in 1538. There are obviously some similarities, but some major differences. Things to note in terms of the hand placement of Titian's Venus. Her hand is sort of curled and sort of appears to entice the viewer, while the placement of Manet's model, her hand appears to block. And some people or historians have interpreted this as a symbol of her sexual independence from men and her role as a prostitute, where she is granting or restricting access to her body in return for payment. Manet has also done some other switches. He's replaced the little dog here, which is a symbol of fidelity, in Titian's painting with a black cat, which traditionally symbolized prostitution. Olympia disdainfully ignores the flowers presented to her by her servant, which are probably a gift from a client. And again, this is her power in terms of being able to sort of reject, or control, reject suitors and be able to control her own sexuality. And some even have suggested that her gaze or her look, it's almost like she's looking in the direction of a doorway, and that perhaps a client is coming in and startling her. As we pointed out earlier, Luncheon in the Grass, the painting deviates from the academic canon and style. Again, we see the characteristics of Manet's quick brushstrokes. There's also this indication of studio lighting that creates these sort of flat, large color surfaces and shallow depth. And again, very different from the smooth, idealized nude of Ingres's Odalisque. Again, some differences when we look at Grand Odalisque. Ingres was depicting the exotic, the other, and and sort of distance the Parisian viewer, making it okay for them to look at this this harem woman, this exotic harem woman, and from a distant country. Olympia in Manet's painting is depicted as a real woman, and her nakedness is also very emphasized by this harsh sort of interior or studio lighting as well. Again, this is a very large canvas. It's about 51 by 74 inches, again, which is rather large for a genre style painting. Most paintings this size, again, depicted historical or mythological events. So the size of the work, among other factors, caused surprise. Again, remember, large-scale paintings were reserved for for religious, historical, and so there is this movement of these genre scenes replacing these high art subjects. Finally, Olympia is also depicted as very thin by artistic standards. Let me go back to the image of Titian. When we look at the image of Titian, we see that the female body is definitely much more curvy, much more voluptuous, softer, and, artistic standards of the time considered the figure of Olympia as kind of undeveloped and more girlish than womanly, and this also was sort of something shocking to the audience as well. Just to show you this tradition of the reclining nude, there is also some similarity to Francisco Goya, who was a romantic painter that we discussed earlier. This is his painting La Maja Desnuda. And so again, you can sort of compare and contrast these two images. So when Manet's Olympia was exhibited, it caused near riots to break out, and the painting actually had to be moved above a doorway to protect it from being damaged, and then the government even had to come and intervene and ended up taking possession of it in order to protect it. Prostitution was legal during this time, and prostitutes were very business-oriented. They even kept records. Again, the model is thought to be Victorine, Manet's model from Luncheon on the Grass. And while prostitution was legal, the idea was that people didn't want to know about it. And probably some of her own clients actually had to view the painting standing there with their families, which must have been very uncomfortable, very uncomfortable situation for them. So it's interesting that through Manet's Olympia and through art, we're really seeing these sort of 19th century developments and attitudes about class, about sexuality, about gender and power relationships. We'll continue to look at some details. Again, I just wanted to also point out, in addition to her confronting gaze, her body language is very erect, very confident, and she, appears, I think probably to this 19th century audience as very self-possessing, again, which is something that women should not be in the 19th century. In fact, some people believe that now, today, that women should be more subservient. I wanted to touch upon the identity of the black servant that is portrayed in Olympia. I wanted to show you some examples that there are pictorial precedents for nude women attended by black servants that have been painted by painters such as Ingres. in the top left corner, we see Engres's Odalisque the Slave, and then here in another painter, Leon Bounaville's Esther with Odalisque. And here, Manet does change it up. He's not depicting a goddess or an odalisque, a harem woman, an exotic other, but a high-class prostitute being waited on. So we look at Manet's Olympia. Obviously, the presence of a maid shows her power and wealth. There has been some research on the model for the maid in Manet's painting, and it's thought to be the same model used in another French artist's painting named Féon, who was a fashionable painter of these sort of picturesque views of the Brittany coast of northern France. And at least two of his works contain a black servant working in a white bourgeois household. And so some researchers have found out that they think the woman's name was Laura, and she was thought to be a popular... Sorry, my dog is upset. Give me a minute to calm her down. Sorry about that. As I was saying, she was thought to be a popular artist model, whose face and figure appeared in several works. Chloe? By modernist painters of the 1860s. There is some speculation about her origin, with most assuming that she has a connection with Africa or the Caribbean. So Edouard Manet in his Olympia, has the sort of the same composition, and he also portrayed his painting in the very same salon that the Childlike Kiss was displayed. And there are some similarities. When we look at Féon's painting, there's a similar contrast in skin color between the two women, denoting their different occupational and social statuses. But unlike Féon's academic subject matter and sort of appealing to this idea of maternity, maternal devotion, Manet is avoiding sentimentality altogether, opting instead to really pursue the erotic and sort of sexual idea of the reclining nude female or the white courtesan on display. But you can see that in similarities, there's the servant is wearing a headdress, similar headdresses and similar outfits. In Manet's, we see that the servant is bringing a bouquet of flowers to her mistress, again, maybe from an admirer. But when you look at the two, their faces really do strongly resemble each other. And so a lot of historians believe that the model must have been the same person. Let's continue to look at some details. So again, when we zoom in, we can really see, while Manet had a very unfinished sort of painterly style, and we can see his brushstrokes, we also see how he outlined. He really did outline and really wasn't thinking about transitional tones, and the figures do have a flatness to them, very much like Japanese prints. And again, when we compared and contrast this painting to Titian's Venus of Urbino, I wanted, again, to show you the different hand gesture, where she really is sort of clamping down and showing that she controls her sexuality and she doesn't belong to anyone, which is very different than the image of the Venus of Urbino. Let me get back to that image, where this painting was done of a courtesan, but she was the Duke of Urbino's courtesan, his mistress, and his, in many ways, his property. And so this was a painting that was done for him, and he even hid it behind a curtain, and even the way she's looking up at us is this idea that she's submissive. So very, very different. Very much referencing each other, but very different at the same time. Another interesting detail is the little shoes, these little clog slippers that she's wearing. These are thought to be these sort of bedroom slippers or shoes that prostitutes did wear. And again, this really sort of demystifies her as a classical nude. Let me kind of get to the larger image. You can get a better sense of the shoe. And as opposed to her being a classical nude, with her being sort of partially clothed wearing the shoes, she seems more naked. And so there is this sort of distinction between being nude, that's sophisticated, and then being naked, which is, a little bit different, a little bit more erotic and naughty, I guess. So we're going to look at one more work by Manet. These are earlier works done by him. And when we look at his earlier works, I want to reiterate that Manet was not an impressionist. He did pave the way and will become sort of known as the father of Impressionism, but he never did exhibit with the Impressionist painters and is really considered more of a realist painter. So this is the last of Manet's paintings that we're going to be looking at. This is Manet's bar at Folies-Bergère, I can't say it, done between 1881 and 1882. This was also painted and exhibited at the Paris Salon in 1882. This was the last major work by Manet, and he depicts a scene in the Folies-Bergère nightclub, which was a bar and nightclub in Paris. And so this was a kind of new establishment that brought all these different types of classes together. So you have the working class, you have socialites, you have businessmen, but you also have laborers and workers, all sort of, coexisting in this environment. So this was another sort of modernist and sort of realist subject matter. And it really does exemplify his commitment to the movement of realism. Again, it's a detailed representation of a contemporary scene. And what you see is a central figure that stands before a mirror. And so this mirror and sort of the arrangement has really been, there's been a lot of speculation with art historians and critics. Critics accuse Manet at first of his ignorance of perspective, alleging the various impossibilities of the painting in terms of this wouldn't be possible, like we would see her, and then we see this interaction between her and a patron of the bar, that, would seem incorrect in terms of perspective. In 2000, however, a photograph taken from a suitable point of view of a staged reconstruction of the scene was shown to reproduce the scene as painted by Manet. According to this reconstruction, the conversation that we have assumed was transpiring between the barmaid and the gentleman is revealed to be an optical trick. The man stands outside of the painter's field of vision to the left and looks away from the barmaid, rather than standing right in front of her. So, that's the idea that, he would be right there. As it appears, the observer should be standing to the right and closer to the bar than the man whose reflection appears at the right edge of the picture. And so basically, this is just showing you that he was thinking about perspective, and he actually was being very realistic in his depiction. And this was a very unusual departure from the sort of central point of view usually assumed when viewing pictures drawn according to perspective. The presence of the mirror also has been there's been a lot of speculation about that, and obviously there are some meaningful parallels that can be made with Velázquez's Las Mañanas, and Manet was a great admirer of Velázquez as well. So again, we can maybe make some comparisons to these two paintings as well. The painting is also rich in detail and provides us these clues to sort of the social class of the 19th century during this time. Again, the woman at the bar is a real person. Her name was Suzanne. who worked as a barmaid at this establishment in the early 1880s. It's thought that Manet posed her in his studio, and also this allusion to the oranges I mentioned earlier in the foreground. We see oranges depicted here, and this identifies her as a prostitute, and this was a theory brought by an art historian named Larry Legault, who says that Manet habitually associated oranges with prostitutes in his paintings. Also, other historians have said that the barmaid is intended to represent one of the prostitutes for which the bar was well known to, be a source of providing patrons with. So not only is she represented as a salesperson, but she's also represented as a commodity, something to be purchased along with a drink. Other notable details include a pair of green feet in the upper, I don't know if you've noticed here in the upper left-hand corner, which belong to a trapeze artist who is performing above the restaurant's patrons. Again, this must have been a very swanky establishment. It was probably a lot of fun to go there. The beer bottles are depicted as well in the foreground, and they're easily identifiable. And it's been noted that the triangle label is a Bass Pale Ale, and so this is an English brand of beer instead of a German beer, and so this was also supposed to represent this documentation of anti-German sentiment in France during the decade after the Franco-Prussian War. My dogs are fighting. That's them arguing. I don't know if you can hear them playing. But this concludes part one of our segment on realism and impressionism. In our next segment, we will be looking at impressionism and looking at the work of Monet. So stay tuned.